I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at the movies.
Movies. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of Jim and Garrett at the Movies. This week we are reviewing Jojo Rabbit, and we're also discussing the latest in the saga of the Release the Snyder Cut drama. We had promised to do our Doctor Sleep review, but that's going to be a little bit delayed by a couple weeks. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. But for now, Taika Waititi's anti-hate satire, starring Roman Griffin Davis, Thomasin McKenzie, and the great Taika Waititi as Adolf Hitler. It tells the story of a young boy growing up in Nazi Germany whose imaginary friend is Adolf, and he is committed to a nationalist cause until he finds out that his mother, played by Scarlett Johansson, is harboring a young Jewish girl in their house. I'm spoiler alert, I am definitely going to recommend this movie, but not spoilers for the film. What do you say, Garrett?
This is a film which I'm honestly very surprised was able to get made. I think it's quite clear that this is a check that Taika Waititi is cashing off of the incredible success of the last Thor movie. Because if that film hadn't blown up and been incredibly successful, I don't imagine anyone would greenlight a film that is a comedy that stars Adolf Hitler, and it's about about Nazi youth. That does not seem on its face like the kind of thing that would fly in 2019. But not only does Taika Waititi manage to get this movie made, manages to get it made with his incredibly indelible stamp. That is, it is a film that I think only he could make. Other people might try it. Other people might do something, in the general ballpark. But this film is something that could not have been made, I think, by any other filmmaker. It is quirky, it is zany, it is funny, and it has also manages to deal with some serious themes. It has fantastic acting from Roman Griffin Davis, who as JoJo is just, I think, bulletproof, flawless, never once saw anything other than Jojo Rabbit when he's on screen, which is not an easy thing for, how old is he? 9, 10 years old. I mean, it's incredible for an actor that young, and a wonderful supporting cast, not only from Taika Waititi and Scarlett Johansson, but also Sam Rockwell, Rebel
Right.
Wilson, Stephen Merchant, and another young actor, Archie Yates, who plays JoJo's best friend Yorkie, who every single scene he is in, he steals it. He is hilarious. His delivery is pitch perfect. So yeah, there is a tremendous amount that works about this movie, and none of it should work, but all of it does.
I generally agree with you. I want to sort of slow this thing down, because what we have in the structure of Jojo Rabbit is a nationalist young boy who starts the movie, um, i- you know, fully committed to the cause of his country. And I think it is rather easy to dismiss his commitment to Nazi Germany and nationalism as sort of the hallmarks of youth. Something that is just like an imaginary friend, something that you would definitely leave behind, something that you're not totally committed to. But I think that what Roman Griffin Davis and Taika Waititi do in this film is talk about how the commitment of childhood seems really serious at the time and something that is not something to be taken lightly. And in fact, the fact that this boy believes in this nationalist cause is not something that we should uh, think of as trivial. And as we often do with young characters, we often sort of trivialize them. And I think that Watiti makes an incredible artistic choice in this movie to not trivialize the degree to which Jojo is committed to this cause. And then the movie spends a remarkable amount of time developing the relationship between his character and Thomasin Davis's character, the young Jewish, or Thomasin McKenzie's character, sorry. Thomasin McKenzie's character spends a remarkable amount of time between Jojo and the young Jewish girl hiding within his house. And because of that relationship, and because of the degree to which that relationship is taken seriously, and that relationship sort of mirrors a criticism of nationalism, I think this movie shines. But I mean, I think it's easy to sort of get lost in the Taika Waititi and Sam Rockwell broad comedic bits and lose the fact that at the heart of this story is a brilliant relationship that forms between Jojo and Thomasin McKenzie's character, Elsa. I think that is the heart of this movie, and because that heart works so well, I end up absolutely loving this movie. I agree with you about your Archie Yates. I agree with you about Rebel Wilson. I agree with you about Sam Rockwell. I agree with you about Taika Waititi. But those are broad comedic performances. Because this movie becomes, for me, a 4-star movie because the heart is so strong.
So when you say it mirrors the National Socialism, the relationship, the developing relationship between Jojo and Elsa mirrors National Socialism, did I catch that right?
No, a satire of nationalism. I'm sorry if I misspoke. I think it's a criticism of nationalism because I think that the essential criticism of this film is that people who are committed to bigoted nationalist causes are committed to bigoted national causes because they don't know the other. And they mythologize and demonize the other. And this film works to say that if you get to know the person that you are otherizing, you have an inability to otherize them and therefore personalize what is other. Does that make
Generically, yeah, generically, I think you're right. Not to get lost into the weeds here, though, but I think that message, that criticism targets the bigotry. I don't think it targets the nationalism. Elsa is a German Jew, so the characters in this film are sort of across the board Jewish, or German. So I don't think that Jojo necessarily challenges or overcomes his nationalism. He definitely challenges and overcomes his Nazism and challenges and overcomes his anti-Semitism. But the nationalism is technically not, I don't think, addressed in the film. But like I said, maybe that's getting in the weeds. Maybe we don't need.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of splitting hairs. I think within the context of this film, nationalism and bigotry are melded. That they're sort of joined. In order to be a nationalist, one must be a bigot in this world. And the way Taika Waititi has created it, and even to some degree, the way history has created it. I mean, how do you be a Nazi without having bigoted feelings? That's
Yeah. I mean, like we could get lost in the weeds on this. We do
Let's
enjoy
not.
discussing our political theory, but maybe that would be doing a disservice to the film to not pay attention to its own merits as such.
All of this is to say that I think this film works because it has heart, and that heart exists in the relationship between Jojo and Elsa.
Mm-hmm. Granted.
Yeah.
I also think that it's worth unpacking the relationship between Jojo and his mother Rosie, played by Scarlett Johansson. I think the relationship with Elsa wouldn't work if the relationship between Jojo and his mother wasn't sort of already established. It is because Jojo reflects on his feelings for his mother that he gives Elsa a chance in the first place. They build up the relationship between Jojo and Elsa on the back of the relationship between Jojo and Rosie.
Sure, I agree with that. But okay, so what I've sort of gone through what I think is the most important element of this film, and that is that relationship that I think really works because of the performance of Thomasin McKenzie and Roman Griffin Davis. What are some of the things about this film that worked for you?
Well,
aside from the acting and
yeah,
all the things you were.
like I say, even as I sit here, having seen it, I'm still kind of surprised and astonished that the film got made and that the film works. This kind of dark comedy satire in 2019 is incredibly relevant. But no one, no one in their right mind, I think, would greenlight a film like this were it not for an incredible faith and trust in the auteurship, for lack of a better word, of Taika Waititi. So his creative stamp, his creative vision, both over the writing of the script and of the directing of the film and of the starring as Adolf Hitler. I mean, really, who casts himself as Adolf Hitler? I mean,
I think
what kind of choice is that?
the story that I heard behind this is that the studio wouldn't greenlight the film unless Waititi agreed to play Hitler.
Really
Uh, yeah. That they wouldn't greenlight it unless he agreed to play the Adolf character. I
interesting.
mean, and its character, it's I mean, obviously it's Hitler, but the credited character is Adolf. It's never actually named as until the end. It's not named as Hitler. So yeah,
Right.
but I mean, this is I agree that it's amazing that this film works, but I think the most interesting question is why does this film work? And it works in part because of these broad comedic elements that work in sort of a producer's vein. That is sort of lampooning and making Nazism as ridiculous and as stupid as possible, but also because it's got that relationship in it. I mean, that's the thing that I dug into most in this movie, the relationship between Jojo and Elsa, and it's these two young actors at the top of their game really carrying this movie. The broad elements are things that I kind of pushed aside. But it's that I found most interesting. But I think the broad elements work. I mean, as you sort of alluded to, um, as it works because it is making Nazism so remarkably stupid and so remarkably crazy that it's bound to be the subject of ridicule, and that's what comedy does so well. It turns what is serious into something that is just dumb and ridiculous. Ridicule is the heart of comedy, and ridicule is the heart of the broad elements, or the center, I should say, of the broad elements of this movie.
I had heard, I'm not sure if this is true, but I'd heard that apparently Taika Waititi actually directed the film, or at least the scenes with Jojo, in costume and in character as Hitler. Um, so that
That's
was again
interesting.
for the director's commentary and the behind the scenes shots on that, right? I hold my breath. So minor, very very minor spoiler here. There's a scene which I think is an arresting scene or fairly early on, in which Jojo is out with his mother, and they come across a
Yes.
gallows in which several people have been hung. And Jojo, quite understandably, sort of horrified, looks away, and Rosie grabs his head and turns his face back and says, "Don't look away." And then Jojo says, "What did they do?" And Rosie's response is, "What they could." And I thought that was just crushingly fantastic. It was so well written, well acted, well paced. It establishes what you need to know about the character of Rosie and the position she finds herself in, and her relationship to her son. It is emotionally compelling, and it sets up an incredibly powerful gut punch, which I'm not going to spoil later on in the film. Yeah, it is a film that has got lots of, like you say, broad comedic elements, but also a satirical plan writ large to deflate Nazism, but it never fails to respect the moral gravity of what Nazism was about and the consequences of Nazism.
Correct.
It doesn't pretend as though it's just ridiculous, so that there was no horror to it. It shows, not in full form, but in enough form to take it seriously, the horrors of the Holocaust.
I agree with all of that. And I think that leads me into my one complaint about this film, and it's kind of this film is I mean, you said well paced, and that's where I'll quibble with you because
No,
uh,
the scene was well paced. That
the
scene,
scene
yeah,
itself was well paced. I think the movie writ large is not well paced.
agreed.
I think the movie writ large is paced the way my father drives. And my father sometimes listens to the podcast, so I realize that I'm criticizing my father's driving in front of my father. But sorry, Dad. So he essentially, as soon as the light turns green, he slams on the gas, and like 5 feet away from the red light, he slams on the brakes. And that's how this movie is paced. It is a little jerky. It doesn't transition too well from its comedic elements to its dramatic elements. That's my one complaint about the movie. But overall, I really, really liked it.
Yeah, there are some pacing problems. There's some structural issues. That can sound like sort of an academic criticism, but I think you feel it when you're watching the film
Yeah.
it's not, stumbling might be too strong a word, but not quite as smooth, not quite as seamless as you might like out of a film. I mean, there's some other minor criticisms too. I think that Stephen Merchant is underused.
Yeah.
He's hilarious. I would have loved to have seen more of him. I'm not sure if maybe sometimes you have to cut scenes for time and stuff like that. But I'm just a Stephen Merchant fan in general. I would have really enjoyed a couple of more sequences with him. And there's some wish fulfillment in it too, in particular at the end, which again it's satisfying, but it's pretty clearly just sort of going for the cheap hurrahs. So
Yeah. So overall, what do you give this movie?
yeah, overall I think I give it 3.5. Again, it's got the quality drama, it's got the quality comedy, but it isn't quite as thorough on either dimensions or integrating them as I would have liked.
I'm at 4, and that mainly rests on the Roman Griffin Davis and Thomasin McKenzie performances. I think those are absolutely fantastic, and I love the fact that this movie takes its time with those scenes instead of quickly diverting to the broad comedy that highlights the trailers but doesn't necessarily highlight the movie. And that is to say that the I should probably reverse the structure of those sentences. The trailers highlight the broad comedic moments, but the film highlights the really incredible heart that makes this movie sing for me. Yeah, I really like this film. It's one of the better films of the year. I don't know if it'll make my top 10. This is actually shaping out to be a relatively strong year for movies, but we'll probably get to that in our year-end reviews. Let us move straight on to our newest news of the release the Snyder Cut drama. The so this has been going on for a while. Justice League famously was released a couple years ago. It was critically panned. It was not necessarily well received. It was originally directed by Zack Snyder. He is the credited director of 2017's Justice League. However, of course, he had to drop out due to the personal tragedy of the suicide of his daughter. Um, Joss Whedon took over production. He ended up writing, Whedon did, significant portions of the script. And as a result, Justice League comes out as this mishmash of multiple kind of styles. The Joss Whedon comedic elements are then mixed in with the Zack Snyder super serious slow-mo moments. And as a result, the film ends up being a critical failure and in many ways the audience failure. A social media campaign, one should say, is started, in which many people suggest that we should hashtag release the Snyder Cut. A couple months ago, Jason Momoa came out and said, "This I've seen the Snyder Cut and it's sick." What the newest developments of this are is that Ben Affleck and Gal Gadot and Zack Snyder have all tweeted hashtag release the Snyder Cut. Now, Garrett, you sent out a tweet about this particular controversy, and I want you to go ahead and let us know what your opinion of this is, and then we'll sort of add some nuance to this controversy and see if we can sort of talk about this a little bit more than just should we release the Snyder Cut or should we not?
Yeah, I mean, this is in some ways obviously a challenging thing to address, in no small part because of the obvious tragedy of Zack Snyder losing his daughter. I mean, that's something that I can't even begin to comprehend. How devastating that must be. For whatever else his flaws, Zack Snyder is clearly committed to his craft and clearly works hard. And to be invest in that in the middle of such an important project that matters so much to you, you poured so much of your life into, and then to have something else, maybe one of the few things in life that matters more to you ripped away from you like that. It makes any kind of sort of criticism or anything like that feel out of place or inappropriate. But that having been said, of course, the film has been released, and now there is all this drama about releasing the Snyder Cut and so forth. So, in as much as we are, amateur critics, talking about this sort of stuff is, sort of what we're obliged to do in this capacity. So I say this with the qualification that, my heart goes out to Zack Snyder and to his family, notwithstanding all of that. Let me also say that, broadly speaking, I like Zack Snyder as a filmmaker. I think he's made lots of good films that I really enjoy, but he's also made some pretty bad movies. And to my mind, I think very few things can take the cake better than Batman v Superman as simply just one of the most god-awful films I've ever seen in my life. And I don't say that with hyperbole. I mean, I really think that film was just terrible in pretty much every capacity. As such, I did not see Justice League. Batman versus Superman left such a bad taste in my mouth. I could not bring myself to go see Justice League. It did not seem worthy of my time. I heard the general consensus that it was better than Batman versus Superman, but that's not saying much, and it was still pretty bad. I am a very big fan of Joss Whedon, and again, I think it's heroic in many ways of him to step in and to do what he could. But even in as much as he could do something, there's not so much you can do when so much of it was already in the can. And yeah, that obviously creates artistic problems with creating of directorial tastes. So that having been said, if you are generally a fan of Batman versus Superman, Justice League, but you do think that it was marred by lack of a single coherent directorial vision, I can understand why someone would want to release the Snyder Cut. And in and of its own sake, again, if that's what someone likes, then more power to you. I'm not going to knock anyone for being a fan of a film, even if it's a film that I really didn't like, or in the case of Justice League, didn't seem to be so bad that I didn't even bother seeing. But to the thing which teed this off, my tweet, in which, again, I hope and understand it's hyperbole and joke, that I think rather than release the Snyder Cut, they ought to recall Batman versus Superman, all of the editions, and come off the shelf so no one has to see that film ever again. Do that first, then maybe release the Snyder Cut of Justice League. So, yeah, it's an interesting curiosity, an experiment in filmmaking to compare and contrast the Snyder Cut from the original cut. But in order for that to be a worthwhile endeavor, the film, either version of the film, would have to be worthy enough of the 2 hour whatever of your time. And I'm sad to say that it doesn't seem to me to be worth 2 minutes of my time, of which I've spent a lot more already talking about. So maybe I should hand it back to you so you can flesh this out a little more.
Sure. Well, let's first talk about how the Snyder Cut doesn't exist. It is not a thing that actually exists. What exists is a rough cut of the film that was assembled by Zack Snyder with unrendered visual effects and unrendered Like it's a rough cut. It's basically taking the principle of photography and then basically putting it together and saying, does this look the way we need it to look before we foist all of the visual effects onto it? Yeah, and then tragedy strikes and you can't really work on it so much. So the Snyder cut, as rumored, doesn't actually exist. So releasing the Snyder cut isn't like opening the vault and then taking a reel of film and then placing it into the hands of people and saying, go ahead and watch this. That is, I think, the image that a lot of people have in their head, and that's a thing that's not going to happen because the reel of film writ large, that's not a thing. What could be a thing is if Warner Brothers would like to invest the money in order to render the visual effects in the rough cut of this movie and then release that, and that would be a significant financial investment on behalf of Warner Brothers to a movie, Justice League, that disappointed at the box office. So Warner would have to do the accounting about its expected gross of the Snyder Cut versus the amount of money that they would have to invest in order to make the Snyder Cut, you know, even close to viable. Because what exists now is simply not viable. It's simply not something that people would go to see. What is also at issue here is this started as sort of a fanboy reaction to Justice League that I am loath to empower. So, considering the backlash to the Last Jedi, the Game of Thrones, and the Game of Thrones last season, and all of these other sort of fanboy reactions that I am not satisfied with the piece of art that you have given me, and therefore I demand change.org. I demand that you make the movie that fits the movie that I have made in my head. And I find that to be, I don't want to empower uh, that kind of mentality. I think that that's problematic. Um, and I think that that is empowering people in a way that um, becomes less focused on an artist and his or her vision and more focused on fan service and more focused on a sense of entitlement that fans have. And I was disappointed by elements of Game of Thrones, the final season of Game of Thrones. I was disappointed by elements of The Last Jedi. I was definitely disappointed with Justice League. I actually argue that it's worse than Batman v Superman because Batman v Superman was bad in interesting ways, and Justice League was bad in very bland and stupid ways. So I actually argue that I hate Justice League more than BVS. So that's my negative point of view of the release the Snyder cut point of view movement. My positive point of view on the release the Snyder cut movement is that we have director's cuts of movies all the time. What is wrong with releasing a director's cut? There's a director's cut of my one of my favorite movies of this year, Midsummer, and I would gladly watch the extra half hour that was cut out of Midsummer, the Ari Aster director's cut. I think that in fact the parts of it that I have seen is have added nuance to that movie that makes me like it more. The director's cut of a lot of films, the director's cut of The Watchmen is a lot better than the original theatrical cut. So it makes a lot of sense that one would want to release the director's cut of Zack Snyder's film. And not only that, considering that what has affected the film was a personal tragedy that you have articulated is something that we have utmost sympathy for Zack Snyder and utmost sympathy for his family. And because this terrible tragedy outside the world of art has affected the art, it makes perfect sense that we would want that to be that we would want to see the fulfillment of his vision. And I think a much more cohesive version of Justice League could exist if Zack Snyder was allowed to do it. So, in my positive release the Snyder Cut point of view, I think that this has sort of gotten blown out of proportion to the point that as I said, we have director's cuts all the time. Why not release a director's cut for this movie? And if Jason Momoa says it's sick, then I'll trust Jason Momoa's kind of point of view on this. If a new Justice League, because I know Warner Brothers is watching, and thank you, like and subscribe. Since I know Warner Brothers is watching, if you release the Snyder Cut, I will watch it, even though I didn't like the original Justice League movie. I just am uncomfortable with the social implications of releasing it. So maybe direct to VOD. What do you say? With that kind of, I think I'm sort of skirting a line between the pro and anti release the Snyder Cut point of view. I want to turn it over to you, Garrett, and see if you have any comments on that before I move on.
It is a bit of a dilemma because, yeah, I think we're living in a time where entitled fanboys are a general problem, and feeding them and empowering them is something that studios, filmmakers, and basically anyone with any taste whatsoever does not want to do. At the same time, your comments about standard director's cuts is well taken. So maybe the best compromise is to release the Snyder Cut later. Give it some time, let it breathe, let it settle down. Take the time to actually, if Zack Snyder is interested.
It's been 2 years. It's 2017 for Justice League.
Yeah, the duration in question isn't from original release. It's from the fervor. It's from the fanboys. Because if the fanboys think they get it because they demanded it, then they're going to become even more insufferable and keep demanding everything. So wait until they stop demanding it. Wait until it dies down. Wait until other movies in the DCEU have been released and have hopefully sort of drowned out the what have you. Again, give Zack Snyder some time if he wants it to go back and to actually pour some more work into it, some of his own time, and maybe even some money to polish up the rough edges, as you say, so you can actually get at least a watchable product. And then, 10 years on or whatever, release a special anniversary commemorative edition that has the original cut and the Snyder Cut with it. Something like that might be a way of satisfying without over satisfying.
So you heard it here first. Let me try that again. So you heard it here first, folks. That means that the Snyder Cut is coming out in 2027. Confirmed. We've broken news. Yeah, I think that it's a difficult question. I think it's much more difficult than it seems at its face. That appeasing toxic elements of the fan base has with its problems. It has with it its financial cost. But at the same time, we release director's cuts all the time. And I don't think that we should be as up in arms about it as we are. So we'll sort of leave it there and move straight along to what are we doing next week? Well, it's going to be unbridled optimism next week. We will be talking about Won't You Be My Neighbor, the documentary that was released last year, in addition to the new Tom Hanks, Mr. Rogers biopic, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. Until next week, I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and Garrett at the movies.
Good night, everybody.